Have you ever been like me and wondered why are disc golf contracts the way they are, and why does it seem like it's such a polar opposite to other sports? Well, today I have a semi-answer for that. Let's get into it. So if you were watching or listening to the most recent episode of the Partee podcast by Hannah Macbeth, she actually had Paul on, and Paul and Valerie Jenkins had some very interesting stuff to say. And they went over some very specific things about contracts that I've never really given too much of a very serious thought about. So the first point was that MLB and NFL contracts are very, very public, whereas disc golf, it's primarily private. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. But I think starting at the big level, the reason why the huge MLB contracts and the Mahomes contracts for NFL are so very public is that it is a great look for the player, for the team, for any sponsors involved. There is a lot going on. Whereas a disc golf sponsorship is much less of signing for a team, it's more so just a sponsor. There is no official governing body for sponsors. It's kind of like the Wild Wild West. You can do basically whatever you want, assuming that both parties are agreeable to that term. So the reason that Paul and Ricky's deal are public is that it is a great look for players and sponsors. It is a good symbiotic relationship. But for players like, let's say, Luke Humphries, I don't really know his contract, but I assume it's not that high. It might be closer to what Christine described, where it's kind of just like a $10K sponsorship, but with a huge asterisk that they cover entry fees, transportation, food, housing. And these are very, very expensive things when you're traveling year round. And I bet it can total up to be 40 or 50,000, even if you're not going crazy on tour. So that would equal to probably like 50 or 60,000 for a base sponsorship. Now that may not seem like a lot because they're still pro athletes. We kind of expect like a high degree of payout for that, but that's not where the sport is at. We have seen again and again and again that even if players or fans expect players like a Kristen Tatar to totally explode on earnings, I believe she recently had like a $125,000 contract per year. So even the best of the best in FPO is nowhere close to where we kind of expect pro players to be. And I'm sure year after year, FPO earnings are going to go way, way up. So that is just a temporary thing. But so many of us expect high earnings, but that is just not the case. And then one of the next big differentiators was that Paul was saying that a lot of NFL and MLB contracts are totally fluffed up. Fluffing kind of means that they didn't really give you the guaranteed number. You hit like your bonuses, your mandatory trainings, mandatory games, all of this stuff, and probably got some good kind of bonuses for getting a certain amount of receiving yards or whatever it is. There is a lot of stuff built into the contract that you might get. Whereas in disc golf, it is a lot more guaranteed. You kind of know that if Paul gets $1 million deal, that is a true $1 million guaranteed. There's no ifs. It is as long as you fulfill your contract, you get $1 million. And what's even more than that is that there are probably multipliers built into these contracts. So let's say you were Isaac Robinson, winning 2 majors, one of them being Worlds. In addition to the earnings you get from the PDGA, I believe Prodigy gave him the exact same earnings to match his win. So while it may not be a true like 2x multiplier, it can kind of get way, way up there. Whereas we don't necessarily hear that or think that when we see a Paul or Isaac win. We're just like, oh yeah, that's awesome. They get like a Signature Series disc and they get all this stuff. But the actual multiplier built into their contract is probably giving them a lot more money than you might guess. So typically we're actually heavily underestimating the potential value of a contract. But that's also not to say that a true $10,000 contract is a bad deal. You get to have free accommodations and flights and travel and food for a full year. So let's say you want to travel throughout the entire US on tour. You can just make that work. And sure, it's not going to be the most glamorous thing. That's just a given. But you have a lot more options than, let's say, other people that are trying to live van life. Let's say Bodanza that was doing van life for a while. He was probably traveling around the US doing fun stuff, but he was probably not getting a good enough source of revenue to sustain himself. So even though it was a very cheap lifestyle, you still can't really do that much unless you're having a good backing of income. But if you're getting all your expenses paid for as a pro player, then you get a lot more flexibility in what you want to do. And another thing brought up by Paul is that these contracts are very, very specific. You may be like a single dude in a very young part of your career getting one particular contract. But let's say you're like a family man like Simon. You might get a totally different contract, even though you both are sponsored by MVP based upon who you are, how good you are, and what you need as a touring player. Whereas most mainstream contracts do not kind of have that stipulation. And it's much more of just, here's a huge sum of money. That's that. There's no like, oh, you have like a family, you want this particular bonus structure, we can work with that. That's not typically a thing in most mainstream sports, but in disc golf it is. And then some of the last points that Paul brought up I found very interesting. First one being that your agent actually has a big negotiating power. they probably know a lot of the contract numbers, whereas nobody else in the industry really knows that, because players may talk, but they don't really know. And the actual agents can have a lot more information to negotiate. Hey, let's say Innova FPO. Owen's making this much, whereas Cat Merch is making this much. I kind of think I should be making X amount. As an agent, you can get a lot more flexibility and get a true value for where your player is at. Whereas if you're just a solo player trying to negotiate where you're at and what value you have a lot less power because you don't know the true numbers. And then the last point brought up is that this is a privilege to be a pro tour player sponsored by these companies. It is not your right, you are not entitled to it, it is just a very nice privilege because you are a great player, allowing good sales to funnel through you as a person. And I think this is very important because we typically see players kind of having a sense of entitlement, especially around contract season. So having this point brought up, sure, it may be kind of like a tough pill to swallow, but it is so very true. Like, Prodigy doesn't owe you anything. Sure, we may expect Prodigy to give Gannon Buhr and Alden Harris a certain level of contract, but once again, it is a private company. They can kind of do whatever they want, but there's no guarantee that they have to pay these players X amount just because the fan base thinks that they should. And while I don't particularly love that point, I think it is important to at least acknowledge. And to go along with that, he brought up players that are a little bit less liked or maybe just fallen out of grace for whatever reason. Like, let's just say they're not doing as good. Like, I don't want to throw out names, but let's just say Joel Freeman. He has had kind of a lot of negative press recently. I met him in person, found him to be a totally chill, normal dude. Sure, he may rage from time to time on tour, but honestly, I think he's a great guy. But let's say that you're Innova. Do you pay him less because he's kind of become a little bit less popular of a player? I would say no, because he's kind of been slowly grinding away, becoming better and better, and he continually has top 5 finishes. And because of these awesome finishes, you can't just forget about him because he has again and again proved himself to be a great player in MPO. And because of that, Innova has to value him very, very highly. Whereas if this was other players that fell out of the limelight and weren't as good, then they don't deserve the same amount of value. So even if you have a good social media presence, according to Paul, that is not nearly as important as being a good player again and again and again, because you get your name in the limelight much, much more, allowing you to be a much more visible player, which will drive a lot more sales than, let's just say, a Kona Panis that has not had a whole lot of press, but gets so much attention on social media. Because according to Paul, after a while, they will just forget about you. Sales will dry up because people just don't think about you nearly as much as if you were a top 5 finisher again and again and again. But I do think it was awesome to get Paul out in the open, getting true takes, because we just rarely see that from Paul. He is usually just kind of like doing his own thing, maybe making a couple of social media posts that are like a little bit hot takey. This was just a good reminder as to what the truth is in the disc golf industry. Like, us as fans, we can only project what we think is going on. He knows everything about these contracts and knows a lot more of the fine-tuned detail that we will probably never know. So seeing that perspective was really, really cool. And I think it does kind of picture a lot of players right now to be a bit entitled, to kind of expect to get a certain high contract because they believe themselves to be a certain level of player with a certain amount of follower count on Instagram, and that perceives them to be a high value player. Whereas sponsors may be like, no, you're just not really driving a whole lot of sales, and you kind of are a salesman for us. So if you're not selling, it's not really going to cut it. And that's kind of like a harsh reality, but that is the world that we live in, and it totally makes sense that businesses have to do what is in their best interest because they can't just be a charity. I would love to know your thoughts, and if you hardcore disagree with Paul, that is also very interesting. Thank you so much for watching. Wild Runs, signing out. Peace.